Salut, saludos, hi. The title of my talk is 20th and 21st Century Anthropologies in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Changes in the Discipline, Reflecting Changes in Political Economy. Before I get going, my name is Kiran Jayaram. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida in the Department of Anthropology. I'm using the term anthropology, which includes ethnology, ethnology, anthropologia, archaeologia. It's a broad term, and we could perhaps discuss at some point, why anthropology as a term and not some other term to be the umbrella term. I will also, in the presentation, use the term Hispaniola. I've written and discussed this at length, so I won't go into it, but that is the term I'm using for the island that includes both countries. So, in the past 3 decades in the United States, the assumed North Atlantic hegemony of anthropological knowledge has been rendered invalid by efforts to decolonize anthropology, according to Faye Harrison, and moves to promote world anthropologies, though the Caribbean has rarely been recognized in such endeavors. Although there are some notable exceptions, the work of Kevin Yelvington, Deborah Thomas, and the book by Mark Schuler, Benedicti, and others. From my earlier work with transnational Hispaniola and ongoing scholarship regarding island anthropologies, I've begun paying attention to the silenced knowledge production on the island of Hispaniola and the intellectual social formations that created it. In this paper, I first discuss the role of the main state-recognized institutions for anthropological knowledge in the respective countries, the Bureau and the Institut and the Faculté d'Ethnologie in Haiti, and the Museo del Hombre Dominicano, and La Universidad Autónoma de Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Next, I draw upon the presentations and discussions from the 2019 Island Anthropology Conference to describe ways in which the social scientists today on both sides of the island practice their trade up to the limits of their ability within existing political economic constraints. I argue that the relationship of anthropologists changed from the 20th to 21st century from one of direct service to the Haitian Dominican states to multiple forms with differential engagements that reflect the country's political and economic realities. By looking at these historical institutions and the contemporary practitioners, we can better understand how these specific dynamics of the state and capitalism within the Caribbean shape these anthropologies' past, present, and possible future. So conceptually, when I was thinking about this project, I obviously recognize that there's been some work to think about and think through the scholarship. There's been very little has been engaged with the national sociologies as it relates to this, although I think it would be important to look through the national anthropologies writings of Gerholm and Hannards from 1982, but more importantly, Faye Harrison's work on decolonizing anthropology and her subsequent work, including her work with the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. Of course, the World Anthropology's work of Lins Ribeiro and Escobar starting in the early 21st century. And then as far as the political economy, I'm following Sharma and Gupta, who to some degree are building upon Philip Abrams' work of historical sociology and the Anthro of the State of Sharma and Gupta, where the state is not this given separate institution, but is something to be interrogated. As far as the economics of this, the political economics, the economic side of it, I'm interested in drawing upon Harvey's notion of capitalism as a difference-producing system. So now, the development of the disciplinary histories of Haiti and the Dominican Republic vary in part due to their colonial, neo-colonial connections and the resulting intellectual social formations. At some point, I will write a fuller account of the precursors and synthesis of the writings of the first wave of anthropologists in each country. But it's important, I think, for this paper to kind of start with Jean-Paris Mars, not to discount the work of Antonin Freeman and Louis-Joseph Janvier from the 19th century, but in Price Mars, whose work articulated with literature and the others in the so-called École Indigéniste, who were writing about the revalorization of something Haitian in the face of US occupation. And Dr. Jean Picard-Biouan has written about this extensively. His work kind of led to this development of two strains of thinking. One, which was somewhat embodied in the Institut d'Ethnologie, the Institute of Ethnology, and that was established in 1941. And then there's the Bureau d'Ethnologie that was also established. And Jacques Roumain who studied in Europe, started teaching at the Bureau of Ethnology, he was teaching on prehistory. He published an article on lithics. He was clearly interested in more of a materialist emphasis and class, and he actually, in 1934, had founded the Communist Party of Haiti, so you can kind of see his ideological bent. The Institute of Ethnology later became under François Duvalier, once he was the president of Haiti, involved Duvalier and a lot of his colleagues. There was an emphasis of race and blackness. And there was tension between the two of them that Martha Ellen Davis discusses in her contribution to the Island Anthropologies volume. Once Duvalier takes over and and starts to name people to positions, he sets up the Faculté d'Ethnologie and names Jean-Baptiste Roumain, not to be confused with Jacques Roumain, who was Jean-Baptiste Roumain was a physical anthropologist by his own description. He was the dean for most of that period of time, from the late 50s into the early 80s, which was most of the time of the Duvalier dictatorship. He was interested in, he did publish some things on African survivals and on Vodou, but he did publish on some things about a lot about race. And there's a lot about morphology and blood types and things like this. And we know this because of his syllabus for his courses and his publications. And actually his student, Jacques Jourdain, became the dean of the Faculté d'Ethnologie, and we have his syllabus as well, and I've talked with him, and he said he basically kept this exact same syllabus and just added a couple of things. So I know exactly the way that Jean-Baptiste Roumain was teaching his physical anthropology and how it very much echoed some of these notions of racial essentialism and blackness that were growing out of Duvalier's noirism. So the point is basically that anthropological knowledge production initially was state-sponsored and internationally informed. Duvalier studied in the US. And the differences reflected competing visions of the nation. Subsequently, Haitian ethnology aligned with a nationalist and authoritarian project that privileged the existence of race and the importance of blackness and an African diasporic elements. Now, in the Dominican Republic, after the killing of the dictator Rafael Trujillo, there was a power struggle, another US occupation, which led to the elections and the installation of Trujillo's protege Balaguer in 1966. So President Balaguer very much was following Trujillo's sort of ideological bent. Although I'm kind of skipping a little bit around Balaguer in order so you understand his ideological understandings, he published his book La Isla al Revés, Haiti y la Nación Dominicana, where he cites Price Mars and other early anthropologists kind of trying to make himself appear like he's engaging with this anthropological scholarly community, but reading it in this totally bizarre way and drawing upon really old scholars to justify, not that Price Mars was dated, but he's just kind of reading it in this really awkward way to demonstrate why the Dominican Republic is different from Haiti, why Dominican Republic is good and it is white, and Haiti is bad and it is black. That's what his book was arguing. And interesting, it was published by this foundation run by this guy, Arquitecto Cara Alvarez, who was the director of the Museo del Hombre Dominicano. So anyway, that brings us to the Museo del Hombre Dominicano, which is this institution in the Plaza de la Cultura. That's from 1973 it was founded. Founded by Luna Calderon, who was a physical anthropologist and studied on pre-Columbian Dominican populations. The first director was, like I said, Arquitecto Cara Alvarez, who silenced blackness by placing only statues of Spanish and indigenous figures out in front. That's kind of this sort of symbolic reading of the ideology of both him and the museum. And only with Bernardo Vega, then another director 5 years later, was Lemba, this figure of this escaped African descendant, emancipated slave, was put in front. So this was kind of a shift, and also marks this political change and the end of Balaguer's 12 years of brutal rule. Now, in Laos, which is the public university, much like the Faculté d'Ethnologie in the State University of Haiti. In the early 60s, you had the Yale-trained anthropologist June Rosenberg, who began offering African diasporic ethnography in the 60s and 70s, Franco Franklin's writings in the early 70s. And the point here is that Dominican anthropology was initially state-sponsored, internationally informed, and linked to a Dominican nationalist and authoritarian project that included the existence of race, idealized Europeanness and indigeneity, and silenced blackness. Subsequently, differences in anthropologia reflected distinct subdisciplinary emphases, differently international incorporations, anti-authoritarianism, and inclusiveness of blackness. So it's almost kind of like a switch from what was going on in Haiti. And it's interesting to note that the brand new 2021 appointed director, Manuel Augusto Vargas Payano, is the first director of the Museo del Hombre Dominicano, who was actually trained as an anthropologist, he was trained at the University of Florida. So to turn quickly to the 21st century in island anthropologies, this was a workshop that was called Island Anthropologies, Anthropological Knowledge Production in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, March 18th to 20th in 2019 at the Biblioteca Nacional in Santo Domingo. It was funded by Winter Gren. There were 25 scholars from Haiti and the Dominican Republic and abroad who were invited to discuss the past, present, and future of anthropology on the island. Now, I won't go into the future of this entire event, but it was based upon transnational Hispaniola, and I won't go into that. There's a whole book that I published about it. There's a website, you can look that up. And there's a section on island anthropologies about it. The proceedings have been translated into 3 languages and are in the process being submitted for publication to presses in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and the US. And a summary and critical response was published by SLACA last year, which I co-authored with some students and a colleague. So while all participants came together from different scholarly traditions and professional positions, and even subdisciplines, as there were archaeologists, linguists, cultural anthropologists, and even a woman who worked in forensics, we all agreed that greater collaboration with our island-based interlocutors would be beneficial, either those from across the island or across the water. They were all committed to a robust critical social science, one free from the biases of the past. And at this point, reflecting on all of it, a key point emerged. So the differences emerged in the professional positions shown. The difference in the professional positions showed a diversity of the funders for anthropological work. so that there were international agencies funding some of the research. So you had Scandinavian NGOs that people were working for, Spanish NGOs. You had the Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie. The Wenner-Gren provided some funding for some of these activities. The Museo del Hombre Dominicano and the Faculté d'Ethnologie still facilitate teaching and research, but it's certainly not very much. There's diversified yet piecemeal government work. The Archivo General de la Nación has something, but again, it's just not really robust at all. There are private funders and private organizations, OMICA as an NGO in the Dominican Republic, the Observatorio de Migración de Migrantes del Caribe in the DR is an NGO that secures funding and conducts research. There are many of the scholars that were at the event were independent consultants and hired by different organizations or the government. There are more institutions of higher ed in the Dominican Republic where anthropologists can teach a course or two. But most of the people have to work 2 or 3 or 4 jobs to meet their needs. So for a quick analysis, I tried to show how 20th century anthropology in Haiti and the DR represents a particular form of knowledge production that, even though it had tensions within it, still held a degree of uniformity. In the 21st century, anthropological knowledge production became much more diverse in terms of who was funding or supporting the work. I am loath to invoke the term neoliberalism for fear of turning a name into a thing. Rather, I find it more meaningful to consider the tendencies of capitalism that toward social difference and heterogeneity, as Harvey talked about. That this continued more than half a century since the Faculté d'Ethnologie and the Museo del Hombre began. This would explain in part the varied economic aspects of these anthropologies. Regarding the state, it still plays a role, but it's no longer the sole means of livelihood for anthropologists in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's simply not viable, most likely due to so-called budget constraints. So in conclusion, when considering how anthropologists in Haiti and the Dominican Republic have contributed to the respective national policies or narratives, I've only begun to touch on all of the dynamics for their histories are over a century long. Even from the beginning in Haiti, Antonin Firmin looked to shape official narratives as a statesman and scholar, much as Price Mars did later. After the demise of 20th century authoritarian regimes, both countries saw a rise in anthropological work that sought to reshape government policy and narratives. This may not be where we need to stop our discussion, though. To really get to the politics of location, we need to decenter the nation as a unit of analysis and ask a different question. How have scholars of Latin America and the Caribbean worked to build equitable, socially just communities of scholars, workers, or populations that are not bound by post-colonial borders? And how can scholars of the US and North Atlantic collaborate to support this future? The answer to those questions is where we need to begin the conversation. Thank you.